Hi guys, welcome back. What if the trenches of World War I held more than mud, fear, and gunfire? What if they also hid a kind of love history? Chose to forget. Letters between soldiers speak of bonds too deep to call friendship. In dugouts and field hospitals, men wrote about longing, jealousy, and devotion feelings that had no name in the Army's code. Official reports called it morale, but censors quietly destroyed what didn't fit the image of the perfect soldier. Were these relationships acts of comfort, rebellion, or simply survival in a world that punished affection? The line between brotherhood and forbidden love blurred in every muddy trench. Drop the time you're watching Morning Midnight or somewhere in between. And if you want history told the way it was lived, not sanitized, hit subscribe, no pressure, but the next story will take you even deeper into the silence of war. History never sleeps. It just waits for someone to listen. It starts with mud. Not poetic mud, the kind that sucks your boots down until you swear the earth itself wants company. You can smell the rot, hear the water slosh inside your socks, and feel the cold crawl up through your uniform. All around you, men curse softly, sharing the same breath, the same damp trench, the same fear. No one speaks of love here yet. It floats between you like smoke. Sometimes it's just a glance across the dugout or the brief touch of a shoulder when someone passes too close. In a place where everything decent has been stripped away, that smallest human warmth feels like rebellion. You might imagine that war, with its grime and danger, leaves no room for tenderness. But look closer. Beneath the thunder of shells and the whistle of bullets, there's an intimacy built on survival itself. When the next explosion could bury you both, you stop caring who reaches for your hand. Soldiers joke crudely by day, but by night, that same humor softens into gestures no one dares to name. Have you ever noticed how crisis makes people drop their masks? The trenches did that for an entire generation of men. In the letters that somehow slipped past censors phrases like, "my dear friend," or "the one who understands me best," carried layers of meaning that mothers at home might never decode. Yet every soldier in the trenches could read between those lines. There's one diary entry from a British private who wrote simply, "He held my face so I would not see the dead." No names, no scandal, just two men trying not to disappear inside the horror. Still, desire doesn't vanish just because law or religion tells it to. It hides sometimes behind jokes, sometimes behind brotherhood. And maybe that's what makes this part of history so quietly beautiful. Because while generals fought for land, the men below fought for something smaller, but just as vital, the right to feel human. One French soldier later recalled how during a night bombardment, he crawled into another man's dugout just to keep from shaking. He wrote, "I didn't want warmth. I wanted to remember I was alive." It's strange, isn't it, how war strips away everything artificial until only truth remains. Even now, historians debate how common these relationships were. But the records, the whispers, and the photographs, Those unguarded smiles tell enough. When the world tried to turn men into machines, they found ways to be human anyway. You can almost see it. Two soldiers sharing a cigarette stub, their helmets tilted toward each other like conspirators against the dark. There's a language in the trenches that never makes it into the manuals. It isn't taught at boot camp or written in any regulation book, yet every man seems to pick it up, especially the ones who feel too much and speak too little. You start to notice it, how a hand offered to help you up lingers just a breath too long. How a cigarette passed between fingers means more than the smoke itself. When every inch of you is bruised, a single act of gentleness feels like treasure. Touch becomes currency. A pat on the back, a shove in jest, the warmth of two bodies pressed under one blanket during artillery fire, these gestures build a vocabulary more honest than words. Maybe it's easier this way, when the language has failed and shouting orders is the only thing men are expected to do. It's the small things, sharing a mug of tea, mending a torn sleeve, brushing mud off someone's cheek, that become secret ways of saying I see you. You begin to realize how close quarters reshape everything. There's no privacy, no distance. And in that forced closeness, friendship slides into something quieter, heavier. The French called it camaraderie. The Germans called it Kameradschaft. But in every tongue, it meant more than comradeship. It meant survival, tied to another heartbeat. Have you ever found yourself drawn to someone just because they understood your silence better than anyone else? That was trench life. Soldiers invented coded rituals. A joke could mean stay safe. A shared razor could mean I trust you. A hand resting on a knee under the table in a field mess could mean I can't say it out loud. These weren't grand declarations. They were careful acts of existence. Because one wrong word could destroy a man's career or his life. And then there was the wants of the eyes. Across a muddy trench or over a mess tin of stew, a look might last half a second longer than it should. Just long enough to spark questions neither man could afford to ask. You'd think love in wartime would come with drama and violins, but often it came with mud lice and tin cups of cold soup. Yet somehow, that made it feel even more real. Historians sometimes describe this as situational affection, as if it were a product of circumstance like frostbite or hunger. But for the men living it, it wasn't a theory. It was a heartbeat under a blanket. Some men forgot once peace returned. Others never did. A British corporal later wrote, "The war took my innocence, yes, but it gave me someone who saw me when I thought I was invisible." And that's the strange thing about human connection. It finds a way, even in the worst possible place. You could line up 100 soldiers in identical uniforms, and still two would find each other. Maybe because in war, when death is everywhere, love, even unspoken, feels like defiance. You start to understand how dangerous honesty could be when it's trapped on paper. Every letter home is red-stamped, and sometimes shredded by unseen hands, military censors hunting for secrets that might help the enemy, or worse, scandalize the government. Yet men still write. They risk everything for the comfort of words that might never reach the one who matters most. Imagine sitting in a dim dugout candle wax, dripping over your fingers, trying to find a way to say I miss you without saying it. You write, "The nights are long," or "I think of the quiet back home." To anyone else, it's harmless, but to the one who knows, it's a confession disguised as routine. Some letters made it through. Others ended up in tidy piles marked confiscated. Historians later found some of those piles. Among them, a letter from a British soldier to another man. "You are all my thoughts, and I should be glad of the smallest word from you." The censor scribbled improper across it and returned it to the file. Can you imagine the shame and the ache of knowing even your longing was a crime? Still, they wrote, because silence is heavier than punishment. Diaries hidden in rucksacks tell the same story. A French soldier, barely 20, filled his pages with coded poetry, half metaphors, half prayers. One line reads, "If I must die tomorrow, let it be with his hand on mine." That diary was never meant to survive, but it did. And in doing so, it turned into something larger than confession. It became proof that affection lived where death reigned. Even on the German side, some officers' journals reveal startling honesty. One lieutenant wrote about the comfort of a comrade's warmth on frozen nights, and then abruptly tore out 3 pages. Those missing pages might say everything we'll never know. Sometimes history hides not because it's forgotten, but because someone once had to protect it. You might wonder how they kept such feelings alive, surrounded by so much death. Maybe it's because writing lets you reclaim a piece of your humanity. When everything else is uniforms, ranks, and orders, your words belong only to you and to the one you hope might one day read them. And sometimes the soldiers outsmarted the censors. They used poetry from famous authors or lines from operas as coded messages. A simple quote from Shakespeare, "When I shall see thee again, I know not," became a declaration wrapped in respectability. They hid their hearts behind culture. Smart, isn't it? The sad irony is that these fragments, the diaries, the scratched notes, the folded scraps tucked in coat pockets, now tell us more about love in war than any official report ever could. The Army tried to erase them, but history, like affection, finds a way to endure. They say war makes men rough, but step into a city on leave and you'll see another kind of transformation. The mud-caked private becomes a man with polished boots and slicked hair, his pay burning in his pocket, his pulse hungry for something the trenches can't give. They thought they were escaping the battlefield, but for many, the real danger waited in the quiet corners of a London club or a Paris backstreet. You slip through fog and laughter into those hidden spaces. A bar that calls itself Frontline. A boarding house where everyone seems to know everyone else. A theater dressing room that smells of powder and gin. Here, uniforms are more than symbols of duty, they're invitations. The rules of the Army fade, replaced by rules of risk. A touch, a glance, a whispered joke, all charged with the thrill of being seen. In London, places like the Fitzroy Tavern or the Café Royal became quiet gathering grounds for soldiers and artists alike. You might find a young poet sitting beside a captain, both pretending to discuss literature, but really watching the way each other smiles. Siegfried Sassoon, one of the war's most famous poets, would later write about the closeness of men who shared terror and tenderness alike. And though he never named anyone, his words carried the electricity of things only half confessed. Paris, of course, had its own rhythm. The war had drained the city of illusion, leaving behind people who lived faster, risked more, and loved recklessly. Soldiers on leave wandered into Montmartre or Pigalle, where jazz and absinthe blurred the lines between classes and desires. Some of those encounters lasted an hour, others became lifelong secrets. It's strange how a world falling apart can also make people cling tighter to the living. Even the officers' clubs weren't as sterile as their brass buttons suggested. Behind the polite toasts and patriotic songs, there were glances that lingered too long, conversations that drifted too far from strategy. Rank offered protection, at least for those with the right name or reputation. A scandal could ruin a private, but an officer with influence might simply be transferred. Funny how discipline bends for the privileged, isn't it? Every army had its underground. In Berlin and Rome and Vienna, wherever soldiers gathered, stories circulated about the colonel's friend or the driver who stayed too close. They weren't jokes. Not really. They were warnings disguised as gossip. Yet people still risked it. Why? Because even brief connection feels worth a lifetime of loneliness. Picture this: a smoky Paris room, the hum of a gramophone, two men laughing too loudly at something that isn't funny. One reaches to light the other's cigarette, and for a second, the world stops pretending. That's not sin. That's survival. And when morning came, they'd button up, straighten caps, and march back to the front, back into the mud, carrying that flicker of warmth like contraband. It always begins the same way: a rumor. One soldier talks too freely after a few drinks. Another is caught lingering in the wrong barracks. A letter gets intercepted. Suddenly, whispers turn into reports, and reports turn into trials. The army, after all, has to keep its image spotless, even when the mud is everywhere else. Courts martial for indecency or unnatural offenses filled the margins of military paperwork. Some cases never made it that far, handled quietly behind closed tent flaps. The command didn't want scandal, just control. If a soldier was valuable, he might be reassigned. If not, he might vanish from the roster entirely. One of the most infamous cases was that of a British officer caught in 1917 with another man. The newspapers wrote only that he was dismissed for conduct unbecoming. His name disappeared from official history, but his letters later found in an attic tell the truth. He wrote, "They'll call me a disgrace." Yet the only disgrace was the loneliness they made me live with. That one line says more than 100 verdicts ever could. Meanwhile, the same commanders who punished others sometimes held their own secrets. Rank and influence could wrap shame in respectability. It's an old pattern. Power shields itself even as it condemns. Have you ever noticed how the loudest moralizers are often hiding the biggest secrets? The Great War was no exception. The French army had its share of scandals too. In 1916, an inquiry in Verdun exposed several cases among soldiers stationed near the front. The report, stamped confidentiel, quietly concluded that isolated incidents are to be expected under prolonged conditions of stress. Translation: they knew, and they didn't want the world to. Then there were the quiet pardons men whose bravery erased suspicion. A corporal who saved his unit from shellfire might suddenly find his improper behavior file misplaced. a decorated medic could have his transfer delayed just long enough for rumors to die down. Justice in wartime had a short memory when someone was useful. But for the unlucky ones, punishment was swift and brutal. Some were sent to labor camps, others to psychiatric wards where treatment meant humiliation. A few took exile over disgrace. And yet, even in the harshest reports, you can sense a strange contradiction. Pity, admiration, sometimes even envy from those judging them. Because deep down, everyone understood the loneliness of the trenches, the craving to feel something human. Years later, one British historian would admit, our armies preferred silence to honesty. Maybe that's why the stories survived only in fragments, scraps of transcripts, diaries, and rumor. But those fragments matter. They show that behind every headline about heroism, there were also hearts on trial. And through it all, the war machine marched on indifferent. It needed bodies, not souls. But the souls were there anyway, quietly rebelling against invisibility. If you travel beyond Europe's muddy front lines, the story takes on new colors literally. The war was never just British or French or German. It was global, with millions drawn from colonies and distant territories. Men from India, Africa, the Caribbean, Australia, and Southeast Asia marched beside Europeans, often bewildered by a conflict that wasn't truly theirs. And in those encounters between cultures, races, and languages, something unexpected unfolded. Connection, curiosity, sometimes even forbidden affection. Imagine being a Senegalese rifleman stationed in the chill of northern France, sharing a trench with men who had never seen a black soldier before. Or an Indian sepoy trying to make sense of English slang while learning how to dig a trench properly. In those cramped dugouts, the barriers of empire sometimes cracked. One French officer wrote, "They are strangers yet. When shells fall, I reach for their hands first." It wasn't just strategy. It was humanity stripped bare. War does strange things to hierarchy. A white Australian private and a Chinese laborer might share tea because both were homesick. A French colonial officer and a Moroccan cavalryman might spend nights swapping words from each other's languages. Laughter, bridging the unbridgeable. And yes, among those bonds, deeper feelings sometimes grew. The official record won't say so, but soldiers' journals, when read between the lines, whisper it clearly. In Cairo, Alexandria, and Port Said, British troops on leave mingled with local men in cafes, bathhouses, and the winding alleys of old markets. These cities had long histories of tolerance and fluid identity older than the British Empire itself. To Western soldiers, that freedom felt intoxicating. Some discovered a world where affection between men wasn't condemned, merely understood as part of life. Others were too fearful to admit what they'd seen, let alone felt. In the Ottoman territories, the same dynamic appeared in reverse. Turkish and Arab troops stationed with German officers created their own networks of loyalty and secret exchange. One German medic later wrote about a friendship so close it could not be explained in my language. Maybe he didn't need to explain it. What's fascinating is how empire itself, This vast controlling system accidentally created pockets of liberation. The mixing of peoples brought exposure to different traditions of masculinity and affection. In some cultures, touch between men carried no shame. In others, it was coded quiet, but still alive. You begin to see that forbidden is always relative to who's writing the rules. Of course, racism and hierarchy never vanished. Colonial troops often faced mockery from their European comrades, treated as both exotic and inferior. But even in that imbalance, moments of equality flickered. A British soldier once wrote of a Punjabi comrade, "He looked at me as if he knew I was lost, and I was." That one sentence feels like a confession disguised as poetry. When the war ended, many of these men returned home changed not just by battle, but by what they'd seen of each other. Some carried stories they could never tell aloud. Others found themselves longing for a kind of brotherhood they'd never experience again. War forced them together. Peace sent them apart. The war may have been fought by men, but its tenderness often survived through women. You've heard the stories of soldiers at the front. Now step inside a field hospital where the air smells of iodine candle wax and quiet defiance. Here you find nurses, ambulance drivers, and volunteers who see more blood in a week than most will in a lifetime. They wash, bandage, and comfort the dying, and sometimes, in the rare hours between shifts, they reach for each other. The newspapers called them angels. The soldiers called them saints. But the truth is, many of these women became each other's refuge. Letters and diaries from the time speak softly of it. In one, an English nurse writes of her dear companion, a fellow orderly, with whom she shared a narrow cot and endless tea at 3 a.m. "We laughed at the shells, as if they were gossip," she wrote, "and I would rather die beside her than live with a man who never understood." No one censored those words. No one thought to look for danger in tenderness between women. War reshaped women's worlds. For the first time, millions worked in factories, hospitals, and offices. They drove trucks, packed munitions, and ran entire wards while the men were away. When you spend years shoulder to shoulder with another woman, sweating, laughing, and surviving, the line between friendship and love can blur into something wordless. It's not rebellion, it's relief. Even in the midst of suffering, humor thrived. Nurses pinned sarcastic notes to hospital beds. "Please return, soldier," in one piece. They told each other ghost stories to stay awake, stole biscuits from medical stores, and called themselves the Blood and Bandage Brigade. Underneath that wit, though, was a bond as fierce as any in the trenches. Some of those relationships lasted beyond the armistice. In London and Paris, communities of women veterans continued living together, running clinics and charities. The world, eager to push them back into domesticity, didn't know what to make of women who had loved and lost each other in the line of duty. Even among the famous traces remain. The writer Radcliffe Hall, who would later pen The Well of Loneliness, worked for the British war effort and met women whose courage and devotion inspired her. Her novel, banned for indecency, wasn't fiction pulled from air. It was a mirror of countless unnamed lives from that time. It's almost poetic. The same war that tried to crush tenderness gave birth to it in unexpected places. A nurse holding a trembling soldier's hand, another nurse holding hers when he's gone. Maybe that's how compassion survived the gunfire, by passing through hands quietly without permission. So when people say the men came home changed, they forget the women did too. Not because they saw horror, but because in healing others, they discovered new ways to love and to live. You'd think that after 4 years of chaos, armies might have learned something about compassion, but step into a post near the front and you'll see the real machinery of control. Laws, morality, and military order work together like gears, cold, mechanical, unforgiving. Every soldier's body belonged to the state. Every feeling, too, if it interfered with discipline. Before the war, nearly every major nation already had anti-sodomy or gross indecency laws. Britain's Criminal Law Amendment Act, Germany's Paragraph 175. France's Napoleonic Code, though less punitive, and the military ordinances of Russia and Austria-Hungary all drew the same hard-line desire between men was a crime punishable by imprisonment or worse. By 1914, that law book marched to the front alongside the men it would condemn. You might imagine generals had the time to enforce it. But war, ironically, made hypocrisy practical. Armies needed every body they could get, so long as those bodies followed orders. We'll punish it when convenient was the unspoken rule. Commanders quietly looked the other way until scandal threatened morale. One British report admitted that to pursue such matters in wartime would weaken the fighting strength. Translation: they only cared when someone got caught. Still, the moral weight never left the trenches. Chaplains preached chastity to men who hadn't seen a woman in years, while medical officers blamed moral weakness for what was really loneliness and trauma. A psychiatrist in Vienna wrote that unnatural vice spread like disease in the ranks, never mind that most of his patients were simply trying to stay alive. Even outside Europe, colonial regulations copied the same moral blueprint. Indian and African troops served under European codes that condemned acts most of their home cultures had treated with quiet tolerance. In that way, the war didn't just fight nations, it exported shame. The contradiction was everywhere. Posters urged soldiers to fight for freedom, yet freedom of self was the one thing denied. The same army that praised brotherhood in its propaganda sent men to prison for living it too literally. If you listen closely to those wartime sermons, you'll hear the cracks in them. How can a nation preach sacrifice, unity, and love of one's comrades while outlawing the very emotions that made such sacrifice possible? One German officer wrote privately, "The law despises what the war demands." He meant the closeness, the dependence, the affection that kept men from falling apart. That paradox sat at the heart of every regiment. When the fighting stopped, the rules stayed. The trenches had shown that emotion could coexist with duty, but peace brought no reward for that revelation. The laws remained on the books, waiting for the next generation to stumble over them. And yet, inside those regulations, among the stamps and signatures and stern words, you can almost sense a quiet defiance. For every rule written, there was someone somewhere already breaking it. The war didn't just break bodies. It broke minds, and that terrified the authorities almost as much as disobedience did. Shell shock, neurasthenia, hysteria, new words for old pain filled the military hospitals. But behind the talk of nerves and exhaustion, another unease grew. What if the war itself was changing? What it meant to be a man? Doctors, priests, and psychologists gathered to debate it. Some argued that too much proximity among men bred moral weakness. Others blamed long abstinence, suggesting soldiers' minds turned inward. You can almost picture the scene, a room full of academics in starched collars theorizing about desire, while real soldiers outside were just trying to sleep without hearing bombs in their dreams. Psychiatrists like W.H.R. Rivers, who treated Siegfried Sassoon, began to see things differently. Rivers noted that men often spoke about their comrades with tenderness, not deviance. To him, that affection was healing, not harmful. He once wrote, "The cure for trauma lies in the restoration of feeling." The irony: that feeling was precisely what society tried to suppress. Elsewhere, less sympathetic doctors saw danger. German military psychologists linked homosexuality to degeneration, claiming it spread through stress and moral contagion. Their cures ranged from hypnosis to isolation. Imagine surviving Verdun or the Somme only to be told your capacity for love made you ill. The clergy joined the chorus. Chaplains caught between compassion and doctrine often treated confession like contamination. One Catholic priest at the Western Front admitted, "I absolve them for fear not for sin." That might be one of the most honest lines in all the war's theology. Still, amid this swirl of judgment, some medics quietly understood. They saw what touch could do, how a gentle hand on a trembling shoulder calmed a man faster than any sermon. Compassion became an act of rebellion, a form of medicine that no manual prescribed. In field hospitals, nurses and orderlies learned that the line between care and comfort was thin. A bandaged hand might rest a moment too long in another's. A patient might cry into someone's uniform and be held wordlessly until dawn. None of it fit the Army's definition of discipline, but it saved more sanity than any regulation ever did. You could argue that the war forced the world to confront what it had long denied, that human connection in all its forms was essential to survival. And for a brief moment, medical science came close to admitting it. In 1919, a report for the British War Office quietly suggested that emotional attachment between men under strain can produce stability rather than disorder. It was buried in the appendix, but the words were there. Still, when the soldiers went home, most doctors forgot what they'd learned. The new science of the 1920s rewrote compassion into pathology again. But the men who'd lived it, the ones who'd been held in the dark, remembered. Maybe that's why some never spoke of it. Because how could you explain to a peaceful world that the purest kindness you'd ever known came from a war? When the guns finally fell silent, the silence was almost unbearable. The war was over, but the truth it had unearthed about love, fear, and what it meant to be human was already being buried again. You return home, your uniform pressed, your medals polished, but something invisible clings to you. The newspapers call you a hero. The neighbors call you one of the lucky ones, yet you can't tell them that the face you still see when you close your eyes isn't an enemy's, it's a comrade's. You can't say that your heart didn't die on the battlefield. It simply went underground. In peacetime, the world wanted forgetfulness. Governments rewrote the war as a story of courage and sacrifice, not tenderness. Memorials show soldiers standing tall, not holding hands. The letters and diaries that survived were hidden in trunks or burned outright. What had been shared in whispers in the trenches now had to live in silence. Some veterans tried to speak. Writers like Wilfred Owen and Siegfried Sassoon filled their poetry with the aching honesty of what they'd seen and what they'd felt. Owen's lines about the pity of war weren't just about blood and mud. They were about the tenderness that had no place to go once peace returned. Sassoon's diaries hint at it, though his editors later softened the words. History, even in literature, was still afraid of its own reflection. But traces endured. In the 1920s and 30s, as Europe struggled to rebuild, small circles of veterans gathered quietly, some in cafes, others in private societies, to share stories the world refused to hear. They didn't call themselves movements or pioneers. They were simply men and women who had seen too much to pretend again. Meanwhile, politicians and doctors twisted memory to fit new fears. Homosexuality, they claimed, was a moral weakness that threatened national renewal. What they couldn't admit was that the very men they celebrated for bravery had also found courage in love that defied those same laws. The hypocrisy was breathtaking but not surprising. Every empire prefers clean myths to messy truths. Yet memory has its own stubborn will. It hides in unexpected places. In an unsigned photograph of two soldiers leaning into each other's laughter, in a letter never mailed, in the quiet smile of a nurse who kept her friend's brooch long after the war. These fragments speak louder than monuments. And as the decades passed, historians began to listen. Diaries, once dismissed as sentimental, are now recognized for what they are: evidence of an emotional reality that official history erased. The love that dared not speak its name had spoken all along. It was just that the world wasn't ready to hear it. If you walk today through the old battlefields of Flanders or Verdun, you'll see rows of white stones, names carved neat and identical. But beneath those names lie thousands of untold stories, some of bravery, some of terror, and some of love that bloomed in the worst garden imaginable. So maybe the war didn't just destroy it, revealed. It showed that even under the weight of mud law and fear, the human heart kept finding ways to speak. And that perhaps is the real untold history of it all. Not who won or lost, but who dared to feel when feeling was forbidden. And now, as you close your eyes, you can almost hear it, the faint hum of a song the soldiers used to sing to themselves, low and tired, just to stay awake. It's not a hymn of victory, but of survival. And maybe somewhere in that quiet, they're still singing it for you. And in the mud and silence of the Great War, hidden love flickered between soldiers who found humanity where the world had none. Desire, courage, and tenderness all lived beneath the gunfire. Unwritten but unforgettable. Yet while men fought and loved in the trenches, another battlefield waited behind them, the hospitals. Now, let's step into the tragic lives of nurses and women in WWY. The war begins with music and marching boots. You can almost smell the excitement in the air. Fresh ink on recruitment posters, brass bands at train stations, boys waving hats from open carriages. Over by Christmas, they said. No one mentioned the mud. No one mentioned the nurses. And that's your first hook while the world celebrated its heroes in uniform. It forgot the women who would spend the next 4 years stitching those heroes back together. You're one of them, now barely trained, barely old enough, and already caught up in something much larger than patriotism. Maybe you joined the voluntary aid detachment like so many others who wanted to do their part. Maybe you were a suffragette who saw the war as a way to prove women's worth. Or maybe you simply couldn't stand staying home while everyone else was bleeding for a cause. Either way, you've traded your comfort for khaki and your youth for the smell of carbolic acid. At first, it almost feels noble. You stand in crisp white uniform beside the other recruits practicing how to fold bandages and lift patients. The posters made it look graceful, angelic even. In reality, the floor is always sticky, the bandages are always short, and the heroic patients are often ungrateful, delirious, or dying. Your hands will soon tremble from exhaustion, more than fear. Still, you tell yourself, this is what bravery looks like. The hospitals aren't hospitals as you'd imagine them. They're tents, train carriages, old schools turned into wards. The air is thick with disinfectant mud, and something else hope mixed with denial. Men come in missing limbs, faces, or memories. You learn quickly that your job isn't to save them all. It's to keep them from dying too soon. And yet every time one opens his eyes and thanks you, you feel something shift. A fragile human connection that somehow survives the madness. You meet nurses from everywhere, English, French, Australian, Canadian, even Indian orderlies, whose names the officers never bother to learn. It's a strange fellowship. You share stories in whispers during night shifts, swapping tea for chocolate and courage for laughter. One nurse keeps a tiny photo of her dog tucked into her apron. Another swears she'll write a book about all this one day. You're not sure whether to laugh or believe her. Sometimes the trains roll in, so full of wounded that you lose track of the day. You mop, lift, inject, and stitch in endless rhythm. When you finally wash your hands, they're cracked and red. The mirrors in the ward show faces older than they should be. You've only been here weeks, but you've already stopped jumping at explosions in the distance. It's astonishing what a person can get used to when there's no other choice. The letters from home start to sound different too. Mothers write about rationing sisters, about factory work. Brothers about the front. The world outside keeps shrinking until all that's left is this ward. The hum of stretchers, the clatter of metal bowls, the muffled sobs when the morphine runs out. Some nights, you tell yourself you'll remember every name, every face. But there are too many. The human mind wasn't built for this. You might pause now and think, why did so many women volunteer for this? The truth is complicated. For some, it was patriotism. For others, rebellion. Nursing gave women a rare kind of independence, travel pay, if barely enough even authority. But it also came with scrutiny. Women in uniform were supposed to be selfless, pure, untouchable saints in aprons. One rumor about impropriety and your reputation could vanish faster than a soldier's medal in the mud. Still, despite the gossip, the hardship, and the smell that never leaves your hair, you stay. Because leaving would feel worse. because when a boy younger than your little brother grips your hand in terror, you can't imagine being anywhere else. You start to understand something few at home will ever grasp. This war isn't about kings or empires. It's about endurance. And the nurses, the ones history forgets to name, are the quiet engine that keeps that endurance alive. It's late now. The candles flicker. You check one last patient before collapsing onto your cot. Uniform, still stained hair, still pinned heart, still awake. Tomorrow will bring another train, another round of faces, another chance to pretend that kindness can survive chaos. You wake to the sound of boots on wooden floors and stretchers creaking through the corridors. Morning again, or at least what passes for it. The light that filters through the tent canvas is gray and dull, like the war itself. You've been moved to a new hospital near the front, where the smell of gunpowder mingles with disinfectant. Training is over now. Welcome to the real thing. It wasn't long ago that your lessons involved neatly labeled diagrams and carefully folded bandages. Now, the curriculum is chaos. You learn fast or people die. The first lesson, never let your hands shake. The second, never let your face show what your stomach feels. A good nurse can clean a wound without flinching, even when it's obvious the surgeon can't save what's left of the limb. The instructors during training used to quote Florence Nightingale as if she were a military commander. Discipline and light, they'd say. The soldiers worship heroes like Kitchener or Haig, but the nurse's saint is still the lady with the lamp. Her spirit hangs over every ward, stern, immaculate, endlessly patient. But you've started to realize something they don't teach in class. Nightingale never had to manage shell fire. Her lamp never flickered under artillery flashes. You're stationed now just miles behind the front. The wounded arrive in waves, sometimes hundreds in a single night. The stretchers never stop. You wipe mud from faces sliced through uniforms stiff with blood and whisper words that have long lost their meaning. You'll be all right. You both know it's not true, but saying it keeps the air from collapsing. The doctors bark orders, but they're as exhausted as you are. Many of them are barely older than their patients. Some operate 12 hours straight sleeves, soaked through knuckles white around the scalpel. You hand them instruments, steady the light, and ignore the fact that you haven't eaten since yesterday. The only clock that matters here is the heartbeat beneath your fingers. The nurses' quarters, if you can call them that, are little more than cots crammed together behind a curtain. You fall asleep to the sound of coughing, sometimes laughter, sometimes gunfire. When you wake, your back aches, your hands tremble, and your first thought isn't about yourself. It's about how many will arrive today. It's strange how the body adapts. After a while, you stop smelling the blood. You stop hearing the cries. You start measuring time in the rhythm of painkillers and the shuffle of stretchers. And yet, amid all that horror, small mercies appear. A soldier cracks a joke with half his teeth gone. A bandaged patient hums a tune, off-key but earnest. A letter arrives from home with the faint scent of lavender. Those are the moments that keep you upright. You notice the hierarchy here too, an invisible chain of command that feels older than war itself. The surgeons get the credit. The nurses get the work. The officers' wards are cleaner, brighter, quieter. The common soldiers are piled together like forgotten furniture, and yet when night falls, you know who really keeps them alive. It's not the generals or the medals. It's you and the women beside you, your hands raw, your hearts steady, your humor dark enough to survive another shift. Sometimes you find yourself staring at a patient's boots. They all look the same, muddy heavy, unlaced. You wonder how many more pairs will pass through your hands before the war ends. No one says it out loud, but everyone knows there's no such thing as over by Christmas anymore. One night, during a rare lull, a nurse beside you, Clara, from Yorkshire, whispers that she used to work in a bakery. She laughs softly and says the smell of flour still haunts her even now. You tell her you used to hate hospitals. She grins and says, "So did I. Guess we both picked the wrong war." Then you both go back to work. When a soldier dies, you help wrap the body. You smooth the hair close, the eyes tuck in the blanket, as it matters. It doesn't change anything, but it feels like defiance. A tiny rebellion against the chaos. Compassion here is an act of war. The men sometimes call you angels, but you don't feel angelic. Angels don't sweat or cry or flinch when the next stretcher comes in. Still, you keep going. Because someone has to. That's the quiet truth of this job. You don't do it for glory. You do it because if you don't, no one else will. Outside, the artillery begins again. Steady, distant, like the heartbeat of the world itself. You pull the curtain shut and move to the next bed. One more name, one more wound. One more chance to keep someone breathing just a little longer. The next morning doesn't begin. It just continues. The line between days and nights has blurred into one long ache. You've grown used to waking before dawn, slipping into your stiff apron and stepping into a ward that never truly sleeps. The smell hits you first iodine damp canvas and a faint trace of decay that no amount of scrubbing can erase. This is life on the front half hospital, half hell. The patients keep coming. Ambulances rattle up from the trenches, their wheels caked in mud, their stretchers stacked like wood. The men groan, mumble sometimes, sing in delirium. You catch fragments of songs that once meant laughter. Now they sound like prayers. You take one look at their faces and know what the textbooks never taught. There's a difference between pain and the look of someone who's seen too much. Inside the hospital tent buzzes with motion. You hand instruments to the surgeon without needing to be asked, your body moving on instinct. Blood pools on the floor, boots splash through it, and no one stops. The doctors are heroes on paper, but ghosts in real life, pale, hollow-eyed, half-drunk on exhaustion. You know that feeling. And yet something remarkable happens here every day. Life refuses to quit. You see it in the soldier who jokes about his missing arm, in the boy who insists on writing a letter despite having no fingers left to hold a pen. You see it in yourself, too, in the way you keep going when you swore you couldn't. Survival has become a quiet ritual performed without applause, without audience. Sometimes the nurses sneak a moment outside between surgeries. The air is cold, but at least it's clean. You can see the horizon glowing orange where the front line burns. It's strange to think that just a few miles away, Men are dying by the thousands while you stand here clutching a chipped cup of tea. Someone cracks a joke about the mud, and everyone laughs not because it's funny, but because laughter is cheaper than despair. At night, the ward changes character. The lamps cast everything in amber, and the silence feels heavier. Some patients whisper in their sleep. Others never wake again. You move between beds, like a shadow checking pulses, adjusting bandages, pretending you don't notice the empty stretchers being carried out. The hardest part isn't death. It's the stillness that follows it. Once a young soldier grabs your wrist and asks if you think God forgives them. You don't know how to answer. He's not asking about killing. He's asking about surviving when his friends didn't. You tell him yes, because that's the only answer he can bear. Later, when you're alone, you realize it's the answer you needed to hear too. You've met so many faces that they start blending together. But a few you'll never forget, like the Scottish lad who played harmonica with one lung, or the French nurse who smuggled chocolate for the patients, or Sister Elsie who once slapped a colonel for ordering her to abandon a patient mid-surgery. Rank means nothing when someone's dying, she said. The colonel never mentioned it again. For all the discipline and order, the frontline hospitals run on chaos and improvisation. When supplies run out, you use torn uniforms for bandages. When morphine runs low, you lie. You tell the patients they've had enough already, and somehow the mind believes what it needs to. If courage had a smell, it would be antiseptic and lies. There's a rumor that a famous surgeon once said nurses are the quiet army. You think about that sometimes. It's true. You fight battles of your own every day against fever infection, despair. No medals, no fanfare, but victories all the same. And unlike the generals, you see the real war, not the one in headlines, but the one that takes place on faces. A patient asks what the world will be like after this. You pause, unsure how to imagine peace anymore. It's been so long since silence meant anything good. You tell him the world will remember them. It sounds noble, and maybe it's true. But in your gut, you suspect history will move on, polishing its statues of men while forgetting the women who held it together. When dawn creeps back through the cracks of the tent, you're still on your feet. The stretchers have stopped coming for now, and the only sound is the rustle of canvas in the wind. You wash your hands, stare at your reflection in a bucket of cloudy water, and realize you don't look like yourself anymore. You look like someone who's seen too much and somehow kept going anyway. Outside, the first bird you've heard in weeks chirps faintly above the trenches. It sounds fragile, almost absurd, but real. You smile at the sound, and for a moment, it almost feels like hope has a heartbeat again. It starts with a letter, a plain envelope smudged with dirt, delivered by a boy barely old enough to shave. You unfold it with trembling hands, expecting news from home. But it's from someone at the front, a soldier you nursed weeks ago. His handwriting is shaky, but warm. "You saved my life," he writes, "and I think of you every night." In a world torn apart by death, even love begins to sound like rebellion. War doesn't pause for romance, of course, but it finds ways to slip through the cracks. You see it in the letters exchanged between nurses and soldiers, those fragile threads of humanity that survive amid mud and shrapnel. They write about things they miss, music bred fresh from the oven, sunlight on a clean pillow. Sometimes they write about you, and sometimes you write back. Not because you expect anything, but because words are the only gentle thing left. One evening, as you change dressings, a patient jokes that you'll forget him the moment he leaves. You laugh and tell him you forget everyone equally. But later, when the ward finally quiets, you find yourself replaying his voice in your head. It's a dangerous comfort, the kind that keeps you human when you can't afford to be. Love, or something like it, becomes another form of survival. The letters pile up in your drawer, some from patients, some from home, a few from soldiers you'll never see again. The postmark dates jump across months like missing beats in a song. You read them by candlelight, sometimes smiling, sometimes crying, sometimes both at once. You start to realize that even in a war built on statistics, everyone is still writing their own private novel. There's a rumor that one of the nurses, her name's Kitty, was engaged to a pilot. He crashed somewhere in France, and she's never spoken since. She still works every shift, efficient and calm, but her laughter has vanished. When someone mentions his name, her hands freeze for just a second before she keeps going. It's a small pause, but in this place, grief has learned to hide behind movement. The loneliness here is its own kind of battlefield. Every nurse knows it, though few admit it. You care for hundreds of men, but the moment you feel something real, kindness, gratitude, connection, you remind yourself that tomorrow he might be gone. You learn to protect your heart the way soldiers protect their helmets, not out of pride, but survival. Even letters from home start to feel strange. The world beyond the trenches sounds unreal, people complaining about fashion shortages, about tea rations, about the weather. You read those lines and almost laugh. The war has made everything ordinary feel luxurious. You can't imagine caring about stockings when you've spent the week washing blood from sheets. And yet some part of you still longs for normal things. A walk in the park, a good book, a hand to hold without gloves on. It's that longing, not duty, that keeps you from going numb. You've seen too many people die to believe in fairy tales, but you still believe in the small miracles that keep people alive. A nurse who sneaks jam for a wounded soldier. A man who insists on giving you his mother's locket before surgery, just in case. The moments are fleeting, but they're real. Then one night, a letter arrives addressed to the nurse who saved me. You don't even remember his name, only the wound. Shrapnel to the leg. Quiet, polite, always thanked you twice. His handwriting wobbles across the page. He writes that he's back home now, missing part of his leg, but alive. He's married his sweetheart and has started planting roses in his garden. He says he never forgot your kindness. You sit there for a long time, the letter trembling in your hands. The candle burns low, and for once the world feels almost gentle again. But not every story ends that way. You also receive letters that begin with, "We regret to inform you." Messages from mothers, wives, sisters. You recognize the names before you finish the first line. You fold each letter neatly and tuck it away like a small act of respect. No one teaches you how to grieve for hundreds of strangers, so you do it silently between bandages. The next morning the ward is busy again. New faces, new wounds, new beginnings that might not last. You tie your apron, pour hot water, and carry on. The letters in your drawer will wait. The war doesn't. And when a soldier smiles at you with tired eyes and says, "You remind me of home," you don't correct him. You just nod and hand him another cup of tea, pretending for a moment that kindness might still be enough. The front isn't the only place where women fight. Away from the gunfire, the real backbone of the war hums quietly in factory towns and farm fields. If you listen closely, you can almost hear it, the rhythmic clatter of machines, the steady crunch of boots on soil, the heartbeat of women who hold an entire nation together, while the headlines look elsewhere. You've left the hospitals for a brief posting inland to a supply depot near Amiens. Here, the workers are mostly women, nurses on break rotations, wives of soldiers, widows who refuse to sit idle. They load trucks, roll bandages, and pack ammunition until their hands blister. The air smells of oil and rain-soaked wool. A supervisor yells something over the din, but no one really listens. They've learned to tune out orders like background noise. You meet one woman named Margaret, who used to be a school teacher. She laughs when she tells you that grading papers was harder than hauling crates. "At least these don't talk back," she says, patting a box of medical supplies. Her husband's been missing for a year, but she doesn't talk about it. None of them do. They've turned grief into momentum. Back home in Britain, women have filled the jobs men left behind. Trains are driven by women. Munitions are packed by women. Entire farms run on the labor of daughters and wives who once weren't allowed to touch a plow. They call them munitionettes, bright yellow, from the chemicals that stain their skin and hair. The newspapers print photos of them smiling. But the truth is harsher. The fumes make them sick. The explosions unpredictable. The pay still half what men would earn. And yet something powerful is happening beneath the exhaustion. Women are learning their strength not as someone's daughter or wife, but as individuals who can keep a country moving. It's not the equality anyone imagined, but it's a start. You can almost feel history shifting beneath the soot and sweat. One afternoon, as you bandage your own scraped fingers, a lorry rolls by carrying the words Women's Army Auxiliary Corps stenciled on the side. Inside are young women and uniformed clerks, Cook's drivers heading closer to the front. They wave laughing hair tucked under caps too big for their heads. It's impossible not to smile back. Somewhere between fear and fatigue, pride sneaks in. Not everyone approves, of course. Back in London, some politicians mutter that women are forgetting their place, but that place has already changed. When you've seen women drive trucks through shell fire or keep wounded men alive with bare hands, it's hard to go back to pretending they're fragile. The nights here feel different from the wards. There are no moans, no gunfire, just the low rumble of trains and the occasional whistle from a factory shift ending. You sit on a wooden crate, drinking weak tea, and think about the nurses still out there on the front lines. You envy them and pity them in equal measure. The work here is easier on the eyes, harder on the mind. There's too much time to think. Letters from the front drift in like ghosts. Sometimes they're addressed to women who no longer work here, buried under rubble from a factory explosion, or gone home to care for families that no longer exist. You help deliver the letters anyway. It feels like keeping a promise on their behalf. One night, Margaret reads aloud a line from a newspaper. "The hand that rocks the cradle now builds the guns." Everyone laughs at the irony. But beneath that laughter is something unspoken. A realization that when this war ends, women won't go back to silence. They can't. The soldiers will come home expecting the same world they left, but the women will know better. They'll have driven trains, stitched wounds, and held lives in their hands. Power once tasted doesn't vanish easily. The war may have begun as a man's story, but its survival is written in women's ink, sweat, and stubbornness. A whistle blows shift change. The women rise, stretch, and march toward another long night of work. You stay behind for a moment, watching their shadows stretch under the lantern light. They look tired, yes, but unbreakable. Somewhere out there, the war still rages. But here, in this depot, full of laughter and grease and quiet defiance, the future is already being built. You notice it first in the way a room goes quiet. Not from pain you can bandage, but from something that has no shape. A man who survived 3 battles flinches at the clink of a spoon. Another stares at his hands as if they belong to someone else. The surgeons call for basins and gauze. You find yourself wishing for tools that don't exist. By 1915, a new word is on everyone's lips: shell shock. Dr. Charles Myers writes about it in The Lancet, and suddenly the unspeakable has a label. It helps, and it doesn't. The term sounds tidy. The reality isn't. Some men tremble. Some go mute. Some laugh at nothing. And some can't stop hearing shells long after the guns fall silent. You keep a kettle on because hot tea is the only treatment you can always offer. Hospitals sprout special wards for the nervous and mental cases. They look calmer than the surgical tents, but the air feels heavier. At Craig Lockhart, far from the front, Dr. W.H.R. Rivers listens more than he lectures, coaxing words from officers who've forgotten how to speak to themselves. Poets like Siegfried Sassoon and Wilfred Owen pass pages between therapy sessions, turning terror into lines that sound like prayers said sideways. You read one stanza and set it down when your throat tightens. Back at your post, the invisible wounds keep arriving without band music or headlines. A boy with steady hands yesterday can't hold a cup today. Another asks you to sit by his bed and count his breaths with him until dawn. You learn small rituals, cool cloth on a brow, the chair angled so he can see the door, a voice steady enough to borrow calm from. When someone's eyes dart to the tent flap, at a sudden noise, you make a joke gentle enough to land without breaking. Not every officer understands. Some mutter about weakness, about men who need a proper example. You watch a captain order a trembling private back to drill, and you memorize the look on the private's face, so you never mistake fear for laziness again. Later, that same captain returns at midnight and asks very quietly whether you think sleeplessness counts as an illness. You pour him tea and say nothing unkind. Women collect their own silent wounds. You and nurses learn the shape of exhaustion that no cot cures. Some nights you wash your hands long after they're clean, as if water could rinse away memory. A siren far off turns your spine to glass. When a supply cart drops, a crate, half the ward dives under beds before laughter yanks everyone back to the present. You call it nerves, because that's the only word the era allows. But you know it's something wider, a bruise that doesn't show. Vera Brittain writes letters no one wants to write, loses almost everyone she loves, and keeps working anyway. Mary Borden scribbles notes for the book she'll one day call The Forbidden Zone, trying to name the unnameable without breaking it. Mary Chisholm and Elsie Knocker, the Angels of Purvis, run a first aid post practically on the firing line until a blast throws them into history's margins. You tuck these names away like talismans, reminders that witness is a kind of courage. Some remedies help in small ways. Fresh air, when you can steal it. A harmonica passed hand to hand. Letters dictated to you because a man can't bring himself to tell his mother he survives when his friends don't. You learn to ask simple questions that give people back a piece of themselves. What's your favorite street at home? What does your kitchen smell like on Sundays? Have you kept a secret that deserves to breathe? Gas adds a new kind of fear you can't mop up. Masks hang at the ready like extra faces, and gas alarm drills turn everyone's pulse into metronomes. Even men never touched by a cloud wake choking from dreams. You set the masks where hands can find them blind, and you keep eucalyptus near, because even the idea of clean air helps some sleep. When the 1918 influenza sweeps through, it does not care about uniforms, medals, or heroics. It steals breath without artillery and fills your ward faster than any convoy. You watch nurses go down one after another, then stand when your turn somehow doesn't come. The men who survived shells fear a cough more than a barrage. For once, everyone agrees the enemy has no flag. On leave, the quiet feels too loud. A slammed door makes you spill tea. A child's toy drum at a station sends your heart sprinting. You stand in a shop, trying to choose soap, and have to step outside because the colors are too bright. You tell no one because you've been taught to be useful, not heavy. The next morning, you go back to work, and the routine holds you together like stitching. A chaplain visits and talks about courage. Later, he admits he hasn't slept in weeks, that his prayers sound like postcards he can't quite send. You don't try to fix him. You hand him a mug and show him where the blankets are kept. Some days, the best medicine is an errand that proves the day can still be ordinary. You start keeping a small notebook in your apron pocket, jotting down one sentence a day that is neither complaint nor report. The sky looked like clean linen at 5 a.m. Private Hughes laughed at a bad pun. Clara's hand stopped shaking while she tied a knot. It isn't a diary so much as a ledger of remaining human things. On worse days, the notebook reminds you that memory can also record gentleness. There are men who return to the line after rest and swear they're fine. There are men who never go back and swear they wish they could. There are women who will never again stand in a crowded room without finding the exits with their eyes. No one calls it trauma yet, so life finds other words. Temper, weakness, melancholy, nerves. You practice saying softer phrases. Let's get some fresh air, instead of compose yourself. You're not alone, instead of be brave. Sometimes you ask yourself a question. You won't voice aloud, if the body heals without the mind, is that healing? The answer changes depending on the hour. On good mornings, you believe that time and routine can sand down the sharpest edges. On hard nights, you think survival is simply learning to carry weight without letting it crush your ribs. A train whistles in the distance, and the ward stirs. Another convoy will arrive soon, and with it more visible wounds wrapped around invisible ones. You set out clean linens, check the morphine, fold the masks where your hands will find them in the dark. The orderlies sweep the lamps are trimmed, and for a breath, the tent smells almost like lemon oil. Someone hums a hymn out of key, and another voice joins it without knowing the words. When the stretchers finally appear at the flap, you don't feel ready. But readiness hasn't mattered for a long time. You take the first chart, meet the first pair of eyes, and offer the oldest therapy in the world. A calm voice that refuses to leave. Here's the uncomfortable truth. Who gets called angel depends on your accent, your skin, and your father's job. You feel it the way you feel a draft through a closed window, always there, even when everyone pretends the latch is tight. On paper, a uniform should flatten differences. In practice, the badges do their own sorting. The Queen Alexandra's Imperial Military Nursing Service. QAMs, crisp and starched, expects training references, a certain bearing. The Voluntary Aid Detachments, VADs, keen and underprepared, pull from drawing rooms and parish halls, then learn the hard parts on the fly. Working-class women with experience as midwives or hospital aides are welcomed where the need is worst, but rarely promoted beyond where the shouting starts. The war needs every capable hand, yet it still keeps a ledger of who pours the tea and who signs the charts. You notice it in rations quarters' tone of voice. A senior sister addresses some nurses as Miss Surname, others as you there. A matron praises a VAD's natural refinement for setting a table straight, but never mentions the laundress who kept the ward linen from turning to sandpaper. Class is the quiet officer in every room, and it salutes itself first. Yet resistance grows in the oddest places between shifts over kettles in corridors that pretend not to have ears. You trade tasks so the clever girl from a mill town can try theater work. You lose a memo that would have reassigned the best orderly in the building to broom duty because his spelling upset someone. Small rebellions. Nobody sings about them, but they add up like stitches. Names begin to circulate, bright as matches struck in wind. Dr. Elsie Inglis, told by the War Office to go home and sit still, builds the Scottish women's hospitals. Instead, women doctors, women surgeons, women drivers serving in France, Salonika, and Serbia. Nurses in her units run entire field hospitals. Amputate, anesthetize, evacuate, then write reports precise enough to make a general's clerk blush. You copy one line from a dispatch because it feels like a hinge efficiency beyond what could reasonably be expected. Reasonable, it turns out, was simply code for mail. Edith Cavell's name moves through wards like a bell you can't unhear. A British matron in Brussels, she shelters Allied soldiers and helps them escape until the occupation court calls it treason and ends her life in 1915. No speeches, no second chances. Her last words reach you on a scrap of newsprint about duty and forgiveness, and you fold them carefully into your pocket, because courage sometimes needs to be carried. Across the empire, the ledger grows more complicated. Indian stretcher bearers and orderlies keep wards functioning, while European staff get photographed. They carry men through mud that tries to swallow boots whole, then vanish back into the margins when the camera cap clicks. The Indian Military Nursing Service draws largely from Anglo-Indian and European women, while trained Indian nurses find fewer doors propped open for them than anyone admits. You learn names where you can write them down, where you won't forget, and say them out loud so they don't dissolve into native staff. In French hospitals, you meet women from Martinique and Algeria in Red Cross aprons, their competence greeted with admiration in the ward and condescension at the pay desk. In British bases, you hear Caribbean accents in the supply lines and kitchens, the labor essential, and the titles elusive. Equality, the war insists, is a slogan that travels slower than bandages. Across the Atlantic, the contradiction turns sharp enough to cut. The U.S. Army Nurse Corps bars black nurses through most of the war. Then, when influenza crushes the camps in late 1918, finally admits a small number to serve stateside, almost all assigned to segregated wards. You read a clipping about 18 women called in at the crisis, trained ready, and kept out until disease forced the door. The article calls it progress. It reads like rationing compassion. Class threads itself through every hour you work. A VAD from a titled family can make a mistake and be gently corrected. A ward maid from the docks makes the same mistake and collects a reprimand polished like brass. You try a small experiment, swap name badges for a day in your section, and watch how voices soften or sharpen around the same faces. The lesson writes itself in the air like steam. Some people are granted competence as an assumption. Others must pay for it daily. So women push back in the ways they can. A matron writes evaluations that overcredit the overlooked and underpraise the overpraised, balancing a scale no one will admit is tilted. A transport officer misreads an order so that the best driver, yes, the woman from the bicycle shop, keeps her ambulance rather than ceding it to a man newly arrived with better manners and worse reflexes. A senior nurse drags a spare camp cot into the nurse's tent for the Indian orderly whose shift never seems to end, and calls it an infection control decision, because sometimes the right thing needs a bureaucratic disguise. Resistance also looks like record keeping. You start a notebook of names, orderlies, washerwomen, cooks, drivers, next to the procedures you know they made possible. Not a manifesto, just evidence. Someone will say later that women had kind hearts and steady hands, and you want a page that says hearts, hands, and hour counts plus the list of skills no one thought a lady or a laborer should have. Between calls, you try a bit of audience participation with yourself if medals were minted for tasks. Nobody sees who on this ward would carry the most metal by morning. You rank the answers and realize your hierarchy doesn't match the payroll, the duty roster, or the memorials you've seen. It's a humbling discovery, the productive kind. Stories arrive like contraband and travel faster than orders. A Black Canadian volunteer turns a jammed ambulance crank with a fence post and a prayer, then runs night runs until the gearbox gives up. A Welsh teenager teaches herself to read medication charts by copying letters from biscuit tins until the dosage stops being a mystery. A French-Tunisian nurse breezes through triage in 3 languages, then spends her off hours teaching phrases to the rest of you so a man can be told in his own tongue that the pain will ease soon. None of these women sit at the head of anyone's table, yet your ward turns on their axis. Sometimes you wonder if the war itself notices who is carrying it. The headlines prefer generals. The statues prefer horses. Poster artists prefer tidy uniforms and tidy stories. But in the staff tent, you know exactly who keeps the light from going out. People who learn to thread needles by candle, to read faces before charts, to make order where orders fail. Near the end of a long shift, a new sister sighs that she's only a VAD, and you feel annoyance crackle behind your teeth. You hand her the instruments for the next dressing, without comment, then watch her hands steady her jaw, set, her breath even out as the work takes over. Afterward, you tell her what you wish someone had told you. Titles are neat. Competence is necessary. Keep the second, and the first will chase you eventually, or it won't, and the patients won't care either way. When the lamps are lowered, you sit with your notebook and write a single line. Who gets remembered is not the same as who kept us alive today. You underline it twice, not in bitterness, but as a plan. If the monuments will not widen, the memories must. And tomorrow, when the convoy comes, and the room fills again with accents, aprons, and effort, you'll do the oldest, quietest piece of resistance there is. Say names aloud, share skill, and pretend for one blessed hour that the ward has no upstairs or downstairs at all. You learn the cost of kindness, the way sailors learn the sea, by swallowing more of it than anyone thinks possible. Compassion looks simple from a distance. Up close, it has blisters, missed meals, and a fever that won't shake, because you forgot you were mortal while counting someone else's breaths. The first debt comes due in sleep. You owe it, but the war keeps the ledger. You lie down for 10 minutes and wake 3 hours later, because your body staged a small mutiny without filing the paperwork. Night after night, you startle at noises no one else hears, then apologize to the kettle for judging it so loudly for boiling like artillery. Disease takes a cut of everything. In Serbia, typhus rips through wards so fast the charts can't keep up, and women in the Scottish women's hospitals pull double shifts until tired becomes the default setting on their faces. In France, trench fever hops along the cots like a rumor with legs. When influenza arrives in 1918, it ignores uniforms and resumes, and you watch nurses go down in rows that never make the papers the way battles do. You start to recognize the geography of collapse. It's in the way a sister rubs the bridge of her nose before answering a perfectly reasonable question. It's in the cup, left half full, on a windowsill owner called away and never returning to finish it warm. It's in the joke told one time too many, because laughter, like morphine, needs careful dosing or it stops working entirely. Mercy has side effects no one lists. A patient whispers a story you can't unknow, and now you carry it through hand washing, through supper, through the moment you look at the moon and realize you've forgotten how to look at anything without treating it. Is this manageable? Is this urgent? Is this already too late? Your mind clicks through the categories. Even for sunsets. Some costs arrive by water. Hospital ships should have been safe, but the sea learned new manners. Torpedoes find red crosses as easily as flags. You hear about the Britannic's sister to the Titanic, gone in the Aegean in 1916, about the Landovery Castle in 1918, with Canadian nurses aboard who did not come home, about the Glenart Castle the same year, the channel turning into a ledger you don't want to total in ink. The uniforms in those stories are starched. The endings refuse to be. Closer in danger breathes like weather. Mary Chisholm and Elsie Knocker run their first aid post at Purvis until gas seeps where wind should, and they learn that bravery sometimes smells like chlorine. You hang masks on nails where hands can find them without looking, and pretend it's a home decor choice rather than a survival plan. Exhaustion learns your schedule. It meets you at the lint cupboard, at the basin at the door flap, when a convoy rattles in early. You bargain with it like a shopkeeper. 3 more dressings for 20 minutes of sitting, and it nods amiably, then steals the chair out from under you as soon as you turn your back. Have you ever noticed how tired makes you clumsy with kindness, like trying to pour tea while the ship rolls? There's a word you don't have yet, but it follows you like a shadow. Moral injury. It's what settles on your chest after the triage call. You still taste weeks later. The one where 3 lives needed 1 dose, and you chose with a coin no one could see. You tell yourself you did the best possible, and then at night, you argue the case on appeal to a ceiling that declines to rule either way. You maintain little rituals because boundaries keep the tide out. A fresh apron at midnight. A quiet 2-sip rule before reading any telegram. A pencil tucked behind your ear as if graphite were armor. When someone asks whether superstition helps you say, it's not superstition, it's engineering. Bridges need trusses, and so do hearts. Your hands betray you before your voice does. The skin cracks along the knuckles from soap and winter, and you learn a nurse's handshake is not a greeting. It's a weather report. You file tiny crescents out of your nails so gloves don't tear. Then discover the glove of your face is thinner, and sometimes a patient's mother writes thank you in a looped hand that breaks you faster than a full ward ever could. The ledger of names keeps growing. Nurses who will be remembered. Edith Cavell, executed in Brussels. Dr. Elsie Inglis returned from captivity and gone by 1917. Vera Britton, who writes while emptying basins and buries half her heart before the armistice arrives. But there are others you say aloud in the laundry, so they won't be lost in steam. Ada, who could change a dressing with one hand. Mariam, who taught the ward 5 words of Urdu to say comfort properly. Rose, who could make a patient eat by telling the spoon a story. Sometimes, compassion feels like carrying water in a sieve and calling it a bucket. You do it anyway. You keep carrying because some spills still reach the root. A man who hasn't spoken in days asks for jam. Another shaking lets you count his breaths until yours matches. Someone laughs at your dreadful pun on gauze, and the laugh pays for 4 weary hours more than any wage could, on leave you attempt normal, and normal declines the invitation. A shop bell rings, and you inventory exits. A friend complains about the color of a hat, and you think about the color of iodine, of mustard ointment of the sky. The day the convoy didn't make it, and you nod politely, because her peace is something you would like to protect for her, even as yours declines protection. Do you ever try to explain and stop after 3 words because the room hasn't been issued a common language yet? The body keeps receipts. A cough that waits until quiet. A back that argues with stairs. A dream that reruns a corridor you don't remember until you are in it again, holding the other end of a stretcher. You do the math wrong on purpose. Call it tired. Call it weather. Call it anything but what it is, because naming a thing can make it too solid to pocket discreetly and continue walking. You design tiny escapes, the way engineers design valves. A page of a novel before lights out, even if you read the same paragraph 3 times. A game with yourself to find one color in the ward that isn't white, brown, or red. A question for each patient that's about a kitchen, a road, a garden, something that will outlast the map. If you're listening, what would you say is the smell of home? And if you can't smell it yet, can you borrow mine? Fresh bread on a rainy Wednesday and soap that pretends at lavender. The matron notices you noticing yourself and prescribes the thing you forgot existed. A walk. You take it slow as a hymn past piles of crates and a sky that looks undecided. You count crows, not casualties. You let the wind edit your thoughts. By the time you turn back, the tent feels less like a verdict and more like a job you can do for one more shift than you believed an hour ago. None of this makes you a saint. Saints don't have chapped lips and short tempers at 4 in the morning. Saints don't drop a bandage and want to cry because bending feels like a question they cannot answer. What you are is simpler, stubborn, practiced present. The work asks for your softness and then taxes it, so you learn to budget tenderness like fuel, and you keep a reserve for yourself, the way a good driver siphons a secret gallon for the road home someday. The convoy horn sounds and the ward inhales. You set your notebook aside, the one where today's sentence reads, "Clara smiled without forcing it," and you stand where you always stand when the first stretcher clears the flap. There will be more debt by dusk, more ledger lines no accountant can balance, but compassion isn't currency you finish. It's a craft you keep practicing because the hands remember even when the heart is tired. Peace arrives like a telegram with no return address, brief, unbelievable, and immediately someone else's problem. The armistice sirens wail. Church bells fly. Strangers kiss in the streets, and you finish tying a bandage because your ward still has more beds than quiet. The headlines say the war is over. The cots disagree. Influenza does not read newspapers. Neither do nightmares. A few weeks later, the wards begin to thin. Trains carry men home with band music and flags, and you press a parcel into a patient's hands. Wool socks, a bit of chocolate, a note you've rewritten 3 times to make it sound cheerful without lying. Come back and visit, you say, which is code for please live. He salutes you like you outrank him, and for one alarming second, you almost believe you do. Demobilization turns out to be organized chaos with stamp on it. The Army has procedures for sending men back to towns and farms. It has fewer for dismantling a machine that ran on women's work. Your orders arrive in a stack of forms taller than your tea mug. VADs, back to civilian life. QAIMs, reduced temporary contracts, ended with permanent politeness. If war made you necessary, peace makes you surplus. The notice reads, services no longer required, like you're a pair of boots with the wrong polish. The trip home is quieter than the one out. No bands, no flags, just suitcases that refuse to close and hands that won't stop washing themselves even when they're clean. You step off the train and the platform smells like coal and relief, and your mother hugs you hard enough to count your ribs. Someone says you look thin. Someone else says you look different. Both are correct. At first, peace tries on celebration. Neighbors bake cakes. The vicar thanks our gallant lads from the pulpit and includes our brave women as a footnote that makes the pews nod in a way that feels like patting a dog. A few weeks later, celebration tries on normal. The newspapers run adverts for hats. A pamphlet arrives in the post suggesting proper recipes for a thrifty household. Your hands twitch for a chart pad that no longer exists. Work you assume will fill the space. You apply to a hospital, then another. The matrons admire your references and regret your presence. Positions are scarce. One says eyes skimming the page where your experience lives. Married preference another adds as if a ring improves the way one changes dressings. A third sighs about budgets and suggests convalescent homes that pay in gratitude. You hear the phrase restoration of pre-war practices and realize peace is not a season, it's a policy. Back in the city, factories dismiss women by the thousand. Posters urge a gracious return to home life, as if homes had waited in stasis for 4 years, dust sheets, undisturbed soup, eternally just about to simmer. The boys are back, says the headline. The girls' shift is over, says the subtext. Have you ever noticed how gratitude keeps office hours? You try the civilian wards. The pace is slower, the pay meaner, the respect shy. A physician corrects you in front of a patient on a procedure you performed without supervision under shellfire. You swallow the retort because you've been trained to keep the patient calm, not the doctor honest. Later, a young sister asks how you tie your lightning-fast knots, and you feel something soften. You show her twice, then watch her hands learn the rhythm. Teaching you discover is a way to smuggle authority into peacetime. People ask gentle questions with sharp edges. Did you see much? Were you frightened? Is it true about... You edit on the fly, because truth and dinner parties don't mix. When someone says the war must have been dreadful, you answer parts of it, and then ask whether they've tried the jam, because conversation, like triage, sometimes requires diversion. Your body takes inventory without asking permission. Stairs disagree with your knees. Sleep arrives like a thief, sudden, unreliable, and always leaving a mess. A door slams, and your cup overflows. The doctor calls it nerves a diagnosis with impeccable manners and no solutions. He recommends rest and tonics. You recommend he try a night shift with 30 influenza cases and writes the suggestion in your notebook instead of saying it aloud. Friends you haven't seen since 1914 reappear wearing peacetime like new shoes. One complains that the milk has been watery for months. You nod and do the mental math for how many cases of dysentery could be solved with her concern. Another marvels that you are still so feminine after all that. You smile because you refuse to hand her the answer she deserves. The newspapers print lists of the fallen long as ever, but the names of nurses appear less often and smaller when they do. A photograph of a memorial drafts proposal shows a soldier in stone chin, lifted coat, majestic, no apron in sight. You wonder, not entirely kindly, who will nurse the marble when it cracks. Not every door is closed. In 1919, a registration scheme begins to professionalize nursing in Britain. Exam standards a roll of names. It is a step, even if it arrives with the gate of bureaucracy. The same year, the vote tiptoes in for some women over 30 with property, and it feels like a receipt that doesn't cover the bill. You mark the date anyway, because history deserves timestamps, even when it arrives late and underdressed. War widows line up for pensions that don't stretch. Make do, says the pamphlet, which fails to list grief among the items to be budgeted. Mothers wear black for sons, wives for husbands, sisters for brothers. You tuck letters inside a drawer and learn that paper hums in the dark if you leave it alone. A former patient finds you outside a grocer's. He recognizes you by your walk. He says how you tilt towards a noise as if it might ask for help. He's grown a mustache that barely convinces his face to look older. He thanks you, and your whole body attempts humor as a reflex. All part of the service, you say, and he laughs too loudly, which is to say perfectly. He tells you he has a small shop now, that he shouts at the bread for burning when he means to shout at the past. You tell him that's normal, and you both decide, without voting on it, to keep walking the same street sometimes. There are reunions. Some make sense nurses in borrowed hats meeting for tea that tastes like bravery diluted to cafe strength. Stories spill, then settle. Someone says Edith Cavell's name, and the table straightens unconsciously habit, posing as tribute. Someone else mentions Dr. Inglis, her hospitals, her death, and the way a train station seemed briefly like a cathedral the day her body came home. The silence that follows is not empty. It's respectful shelf space. Other reunions are less official. You visit a mechanic school where women trained to drive ambulances now learn to fix lorries because competence is a habit that refuses to sit still. You help a friend from the depot write a letter for a position she will win because everyone in the room already trusts her, even if the letterhead is late to the party. You send a note to the mother of a boy who kept a harmonica by his bed and played you Annie Laurie off-key because remembrance grows where it is watered. You try church again. A hymn reaches a note you haven't heard since a night when the lamp swung and someone held your wrist until the trembling passed. You hold the pew and count your breaths, not because you are faint, but because counting is a bridge between past and present that still holds your weight. If anyone asks you, say the sermon was fine, which covers both the sermon and your detour to the vestibule to stand with the draft. Someone organizes a pageant of gratitude in uniforms with speeches. The men's lines are long and practiced. The women's lines are shorter and delivered between smiles large enough to pass for relief. Afterward, a committee member shakes your hand and says, "We'll never forget." You believe him for the length of the handshake. Memory, you've learned, needs gardeners, not committees. On certain afternoons, you sit by a window and mend a shirt, the needle moving on a track your fingers know by heart. The thread runs smooth, the seam lies flat, and for a brief space your mind holds only the small geometry of cloth and light. Someone knocks. You don't startle. Progress comes disguised as ordinary. A neighbor's daughter asks what the war was like. You look at her shoes first scuffed, listening, and decide her question deserves a true thing she can carry without dropping. Loud, you say, and then very quiet. She nods like you've handed her a map with one clear road on it, and somehow that feels sufficient for today. You keep the apron folded in the bottom drawer, not as a relic, but as a yes you can still point to if anyone ever wonders whether you imagined the whole thing. The notebook lies beside it. Today's sentence reads, Mrs. Ellery's roses survived the frost. You underline the word survived without meaning to, and close the book gently, not because the story is finished, but because the kettle has started to sing. The loudest thing about the Great War now is the silence it leaves in your hands when you pick up a photograph and realize no one in the room can name her. You stare at a nurse in starched white chin lifted, and the caption reads, "Only staff, 1917. That's the trick memory plays. It frames the face and misplaces the life. You start where people think remembrance lives stone. The cenotaph in London stands like a pause carved into air. The Menin Gate echoes each evening with the last post while poppies burn red against gray. You listen respectfully, and then you notice who is missing from the pedestals. Soldiers have horses' swords and bronze weatherproofed glory. Nurses get plaques near doors you could miss if you blinked while tying a scarf. You run your thumb over the engraved names. You do find Edith Cavell in St. Martin's Place, Dr. Elsie Inglis in Edinburgh, and your thumb slows, almost like it's reading Braille for a story the city forgot to speak aloud. Museums try, in their careful way. A case of medals, a corner of uniforms, a diary open to a page where the ink wobbles because the writer was cold or scared or both. You lean in as if the glass could warm with breath. The label mentions Dates Corps theaters of war. It rarely mentions sleep, or the kettle that whistled too loud, or the joke that bought 4 minutes of relief, or the way a ward felt like orchestration played on tired hands. You catch yourself wanting to tape a note to the glass. She laughed. She swore. She kept the lamp trimmed. She mattered. The archives are loud in their quiet way. Boxes of letters tied with string. Ledgers where the hours march in straight lines like proper regiments. A telegram folded so many times it sounds like leaves when you open it. You read Vera Britton's neat handwriting and hear the cadence of someone who did the math of loss and kept going anyway. You read Mary Borden and feel language trying to behave in a room where nothing else would. You read Mary Chisholm's reports and catch the steady drumbeat of competence that has no room for adjectives. Outside, the rituals feel familiar. November's chill paper poppies that pin shirts and prick fingers 2 minutes where the city remembers how to hold its breath. You stand with everyone else grateful and a little lonely for a roll call that still leaves out the laundry list. Washerwomen orderlies, cooks, drivers, clerks, the women who learned to reverse an ambulance in mud without looking. Because looking meant thinking, and thinking meant doubt, and doubt meant delay. You consider the question aloud in your head, because that's how you talk to yourself now. Whose silence are we keeping? And whose silence have we mistaken for absence? You try classrooms because future memory begins where feet swing above the floor. You hold up a photograph and say her name, not just her title. You describe a ward in small, portable truths, the smell of carbolic on knuckles, the way pencil marks smear at 3 a.m., the miracle of hot tea. You ask, what would you pack in your pocket if you were her? And hands go up peppermint, a tiny prayer, a joke to use later, a picture of a dog, and suddenly the room knows her better than most plaques will allow. Digital memory has its own tide. Names once trapped in registry books now flicker on screens. Rolls of honor service records, scans of cramped handwriting that looks like marching ants. Families upload pictures of women who never made the newspapers. A granddaughter captions a photo. Gran refused to talk about the war. She taught me to bandage a finger like it was a crown. You stare at the pixelated crease in the photograph and feel the distance shrink to the width of a teacup. You visit a small-town memorial where someone finally added a bronze nurse to a list of men. The bronze is modest, her posture practical. A passerby says, "About time," and you nod because righteous agreement is easier than the arithmetic of delay. It took a century to grant a statue what a shift rota granted without debate indispensability. You put your hand on the cold metal and imagine it warming, not because stone needs comfort, but because you do. Memory keeps odd hours. In the supermarket queue, a poppy tidy box rattles, and you hear a ward bell. In a florist's window, a spray of white lilies makes you remember the smell of starch and winter, and you have to blink because the street doesn't expect your eyes to water between cauliflowers and bus times. A child on the pavement drags a toy ambulance by a string, and you catch yourself counting the distance to the curb as if a stretcher needed room. History has laid gentle traps in the ordinary, and you step on them with affection more than alarm. You return to Brussels, stand before Cavell's grave at Schaerbeek, and read the sentence everyone quotes about patriotism and duty. You think how neatly courage fits into stone and how messily it lives in flesh. You leave a small paper with a different line written on it. She taught us that mercy is not neutral. You tuck it where the wind might read it, and just for fun, where a curator won't immediately notice. In village halls and church basements, you hear new voices telling old stories, as if opening windows in a room that has been polite for too long. A retired nurse presents a talk on the QAI men's and slips in names from the margins. A local historian points out that the town's roll of honor skipped the pantry staff at the auxiliary hospital, and a great-granddaughter brings a photograph and a cake as evidence that the past bakes as well as it bandages. Someone starts a community quilt, each square for one person who kept someone else breathing, and the texture of remembrance becomes something you can run your hand across. You ask yourself an interactive question because bedtime history likes company. What would justice look like for people who can't come to the ceremony? More scholarships in their names. A ward renamed without the word ladies inserted like lace. A curriculum where children learn that support isn't a lesser heroism, but a different physics. You don't need to answer now. You store the question with your other useful tools. The war altered the climate of the possible. Women who drove ambulances learned streets they would later drive to jobs no one thought to offer them before 1914. Women who managed wards learned budgets, authority calm, and the right size of silence to use in a room that resists your presence. Some married and folded their competence into houses that ran like clockwork. Some never married and taught generations to keep pulse and purpose stealthily aligned. Some became campaigners with patience sharpened by triage. The vote arrived like a partial delivery, then a fuller one, and you track the dates like stations on a line you wish had been express. The erasures are sturdier than you'd like, but they aren't invulnerable. You correct a caption here. Write a letter, there donate a name to a database. Start a conversation that declines to end when the coffee does. You teach the habit of noticing the seamstress in the group photo, the calloused hands hidden by gloves, the tired mouth that still remembers how to smile for someone else's sake. You say it out loud because spoken memory stays aloft longer. She is not scenery. On your own desk, the artifacts are small and immodestly powerful. A thimble, polished thin. A folded apron, tape a notebook with one sentence per day. Today, you write the museum guard asked her knee. You underline her twice, not the guard, then catch yourself and smile because you've become the gardener you needed a century ago. Before sleep, you sometimes set yourself a kinder drill list. 5 things you know, now that stone doesn't. The warmth of a hand before morphine. The comic timing of a woman who can carry a ward on a pun. The way eucalyptus oil nudges panic aside long enough for breathing to negotiate a truce. The precise relief of hearing a kettle when nothing else obeys. The fact that grief and gratitude are neighbors who share sugar across the fence. You don't recite them like liturgy, you arrange them like fresh linen. If you're still awake, and it's okay, if you are, you can try this picture, one nurse whose name you learned today. See her sleeves rolled to the elbow. The pencil behind her ear, the hairpins refusing to surrender. Hear her say something entirely practical like, "We need more light," and watch everyone move. Hold that picture gently until it stops feeling like a stranger and starts feeling like an ancestor. The photograph on your nightstand doesn't speak, but it no longer needs to. The silence that used to mean absence has learned another trick. Presence without performance. You turn out the lamp, a little like trimming it, and the room remembers how to be kind to the dark. Let the ward lights dim in your mind. Bandages, folded kettles. Quiet names softly kept. You walked beside nurses and women who carried courage without medals stitching life, where war unstitched it and teaching the world to remember